I've kept this story buried for decades, not because I forgot, but because remembering was like breathing through smoke, and I thought that hiding it would somehow protect you from the weight I carried, from the man I became when everything I once knew turned to ash. But now, sitting here in this quiet room above the old shoe repair shop, the same place I've spent the last years patching worn souls and worn-out silences, I realize that you deserve to know. Not the version of me that disappeared, but the truth of who I was, who I am, and why I've never said a word until now. I came back from a Soviet prison camp in the spring of 1953. 31 years old, but I felt older than my father ever looked. I stepped off the train into a Pittsburgh that didn't feel like home anymore. Steel mills quieted, storefronts boarded up, the river still ran. But the life I had left behind wasn't waiting for me at the station. No flags, no familiar arms, no you and no her. I stood there for hours. I didn't move because I had nowhere to go and no one to go to. The only thing I brought back with me from captivity was a worn coat, a small leather-bound notebook sewn into the lining, and a folded letter from your mother. The one I'd read so many times I could recite it without unfolding it. She wrote it the week before I shipped out. Her handwriting still smelled like lavender oil and Sunday morning. I learned later, too late, that she died in the winter of '47 when the fever swept through the neighborhood and the hospitals had no more beds. And you, my daughter, had been taken in by your aunt somewhere in Ohio, far from the red brick house we once called home. They told you I had disappeared, that I was lost somewhere over there, that I never came back. And they weren't wrong, but they weren't telling you the whole truth either. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, by letting you live a life without the stain of who I became to survive, without the burden of my silence and the shadow of the war I never left behind. You were just a little girl when I left. And now you're a woman, a mother, someone who deserves more than the holes I left behind in your story. So I write this now, not for redemption, not to erase the years I missed, but so you can finally know the man behind the silence. Your father, broken yes, but always yours. If this story touches you like it did me while writing it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. When I stepped off the train that brought me home, if you can still call it that, I was hoping, foolishly perhaps, for something, a familiar voice, a face in the crowd, a hand raised in cautious recognition. But there was no one, no daughter, no wife. Just cold spring wind brushing through the platforms, blowing newspaper pages like forgotten memories between the boots of strangers who didn't look up, didn't care, didn't know I'd been gone. I stood there for a long time, longer than made sense. One bag, one coat, one name, mine, that I wasn't sure even belonged to me anymore. I hadn't heard it spoken kindly in nearly 9 years. What I had with me, sewn into the lining of that coat, like a secret I was scared to lose, was a notebook I filled in the darkest hours, and your mother's letter, the last words she ever wrote me, back when hope still hung in the air like laundry on the line. It was a Wednesday, or maybe Thursday. Does it matter? The platform felt like a graveyard of things that used to matter. Time, names, promises. The last thing I remember clearly was the exact color of the bricks at Union Station, and the way they seemed smaller than I remembered, like everything had shrunk in my absence. The streets, the homes, the country, even God. I went to the boarding house on the corner of Cedar and Polk, where I used to deliver groceries before the war, and they had a room, cheap, with a bed that creaked, and a window that looked out over the alley behind St. Agnes Church. That's where I slept. That's where I tried to become invisible. Your mother. She died 6 years before I returned. I didn't know. Nobody had written me, and even if they had, the letters would have never made it past the guards. She died of typhoid, they said. Too sick, too fast, too forgotten. No funeral I could attend. No grave I could visit without feeling like I had arrived decades too late to be called a husband. And you You'd been taken in by your aunt, moved to Columbus, raised without the sound of my name in the hallway. I learned you were told I had disappeared. Not dead, not alive, just gone, like smoke. And in many ways, that wasn't untrue. I had disappeared, the man I was when I kissed you goodbye in that wool coat and tucked a ribbon into your pocket. He didn't survive the camp. Something else came back in his place, something thinner, more quiet. I asked around, quietly, didn't want to disturb too much. People looked at me like I was a ghost. Some were kind, others avoided me altogether. My war didn't make me a hero, just another man who didn't die. And in that I found a strange kind of guilt. I found work with an old Polish cobbler who'd lost 3 sons to the war. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. I fixed shoes in a windowless back room, leather soles, busted heels, broken laces. It was honest work, simple work, the kind that didn't require you to talk about where you'd been or who you used to be. I liked that, I needed that. I told myself I would stay for a year, get back on my feet, then find you, tell you everything, try. But time is a cruel trickster. 1 year turned into 5, 5 into 10, and somewhere along the way I became the man who listened for your voice in every child's laugh that passed the shop door. I'd sit on the back steps at dusk, smoking a cigarette I never quite finished, and wonder, was that you who just crossed the street? Was that your bicycle tire I heard on the gravel? Had you already walked past me years ago without knowing who I was? One afternoon I saw you. You were 12, maybe 13, walking down the block with a wicker basket in your arms and your hair in a braid that danced with the wind just like your mother's had. You didn't notice me and I didn't call out. My hands were shaking, my breath caught. I wanted to say something, anything, but I froze, not out of fear, out of shame, because what kind of man reappears after missing half your childhood and thinks he deserves a place in your story? So I let you pass. And then I watched you every Friday, always from a distance, always without a sound. I memorized your walk, the way your coat flared in the breeze, how you looked straight ahead like someone already used to carrying her own weight. I never told a soul, except for Father Callahan, the old priest who came in for repairs every Sunday and sometimes left with a bottle in his coat. He told me, silence doesn't save you. He said, time is like bread. It's best when it's shared. But I wasn't ready to break mine open and find only dust. They took me in the fall of 1944 during a chaotic retreat near the Baltic. One moment we were moving under cover. The next, I was being thrown face down into the dirt by men shouting in a language I barely understood. Their rifles aimed so low they may as well have been digging my grave. From that moment on, time stopped being measured in days or weeks. It became something more primitive, something like hunger or cold or silence. They marched us through forests and villages that looked more like smoke than homes, then packed us into boxcars with no windows, just slits of daylight that came and went like flickers of memory. I lost track of how long we traveled, days surely, but it felt like a year. The air inside was thick with fear and waste. Men stopped talking after the first night. By the time we reached the edge of what they called Vorkuta, a mining colony swallowed by snow and silence, we were more shadows than soldiers. In that camp, the cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a presence. It crept into your bones and whispered that you didn't matter, that you'd never matter again. We worked the mines, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, hauling coal and tools with hands that cracked and bled through tunnels that echoed with prayers said too quietly to hear. You weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to, and when you did speak, it had to be in Russian. I learned quickly that silence was safer, but I needed something, anything, to remind me that I still existed. So I wrote. I wrote with the smallest pencil stub I could trade for bread, scribbled onto scraps of cement bags or the backs of Soviet paperwork, hidden behind a loose brick near my bunk. I wrote letters no one would ever read. To your mother, to you, to a version of myself I hoped still survived, somewhere beneath the frostbite and filth. I remember one night, a storm so brutal it sounded like the sky itself was breaking. I crouched in a corner of the barracks and wrote you a letter, even though I didn't know if you were alive, if you'd remember me, if you even still carried my name. I wrote, "If I ever make it back, I want you to know. You were my greatest fear and my greatest strength." I never sent it. I couldn't. But I memorized every word. I repeated them over and over in the dark like a hymn. What I never wrote, not there, not then, was the truth about what I had to become to stay alive. You survive in a place like that by becoming smaller, quieter, less human. You laugh at cruel jokes. You eat things no one should. You turn your face away when someone is taken in the night because you know if you speak, if you so much as blink, you're next. And you carry that with you, like an invisible brand across your chest, not because you're proud of it, but because shame is the only proof you were there. That's why I stayed silent so long, not because I didn't love you, not because I forgot you, but because I didn't know how to let you see the man I became in that place without you flinching. There was a man, Daniel Kaplan from Iowa, strong, loud, stubborn. He died on a Tuesday. I don't know why I remember the day, but I do. We shared a bunk for nearly 3 years. He talked about cornfields and baseball like they were heaven itself. He used to say, "If you make it out, write it all down, tell someone. Otherwise, what was the point?" But I couldn't write it, not all of it, not until now. You see, survival is a strange kind of sin. Everyone celebrates the man who returns, but no one asks what it cost. I remember one morning we were hauling tools out across the frozen ridge, and I saw a bird, a single ragged bird, flying low above the wire. And it hit me then. This place, this cold, this silence, it wasn't going to kill me. I was already dead. I was just waiting for someone else to say it. But that bird, it wasn't flying north, it was flying west. And in that moment, I felt something crack open in my chest. Hope is dangerous, but it's persistent. I kept that hope folded like paper in my pocket. I kept your name like a prayer. And when the amnesty came, when the war was finally over, truly over, and they gave us paper IDs and told us we could leave, I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I didn't even move at first. I just sat there, holding a piece of paper that said I was free, wondering how to be someone again after being nothing for so long. When I returned, I told myself I wouldn't talk about the camp. I thought that would make it disappear. But it didn't. It stayed with me. And in staying silent, I let the worst parts of that place follow me home. But now, after all these years, I'm done hiding behind that silence. After I came back, after the train pulled away and the city swallowed me in its indifferent grey, I did not return to any house because there was no house to return to, only the crumbling memory of what used to be. So I found a room above the cobbler's shop, the same one where I once bought my first pair of church shoes, and I let myself shrink into the quiet, into a space where no one asked questions, and I never volunteered answers, where the past could hang in the air like dust that never settles but never speaks either. I worked with my hands, stitching leather and hammering soles, fixing what others had worn down, trying to make whole what had been split. And I told myself there was something redemptive in that perhaps if I could mend enough broken things, I could stitch myself back together too, even though I knew deep down that no number of shoes could make up for the fact that I had missed your first essay, your first words, your first fall off a bicycle, your first everything. No one knew who I was. I gave a name, my real one, but it meant nothing to anyone anymore. And in that anonymity, there was a kind of safety, a kind of numb peace, the kind you find not in healing, but in not being noticed. And so the days passed like smoke through cracks in the floorboards, never quite touching anything, just slipping by. Sometimes I heard children playing in the street below, their voices rising like birds, sharp and high, full of things I no longer understood. Joy, innocence, noise without consequence. And I would stop stitching just for a second, and wonder if your voice had ever sounded like that, if you ever skipped rope with your hair tied in ribbons, if you ever laughed the way your mother used to when she danced in the kitchen with flour on her hands and a radio humming softly from the counter. Then one day I saw you. You couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13, walking across the intersection near Market Street, a woven basket on your arm, and your braid falling just the way hers used to, and I knew without knowing. I knew the way you looked over your shoulder, cautious but curious, the way your feet moved with purpose, the way you held your coat closed tight at the neck. And in that single instant, and all the years collapsed into one, and I felt myself become weightless and paralyzed all at once. I wanted to call out, but my throat seized. I wanted to run to you, to tell you who I was, but my feet refused to move. Not from fear of you, but from fear of what you might see when you looked at me. Not a father returned, but a man who had waited too long, who had traded time for silence and come home with nothing but empty hands and memories worn thin. So I let you walk past, and that became a kind of ritual. Every week, every Friday afternoon, I'd watch from the workroom or the upstairs window, see you cross the square, growing taller each season, your steps more assured, your face more certain, and I would sit with that ache in my chest, not just for what I had lost, but for what you never got to have, a father who showed up. I told no one. Not even the old priest, Father Callahan, who came in for repairs and always stayed a little longer than needed, sipping coffee and telling me how time was a door, not a wall, and that it only locked from the inside. But I couldn't turn the key. Not then, not yet, because every time I thought about speaking, I imagined ruining something I never even had the right to touch. He once told me, "You can't carry your story forever. It'll bend your spine and close your eyes." And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I knew he was right. But I was still a coward. The truth is, I didn't stay away because I stopped loving you. I stayed away because I couldn't bear the thought of that love not being enough to undo the damage my absence had caused. And so I made a home out of hiding, a routine out of regret, a life out of looking without reaching. Years passed like that. I watched the world change. Radios became televisions, cars became quieter, people moved faster, but inside, nothing changed at all. Not the ache, not the silence, not the image of you at 12, walking just out of reach. Then one winter, I saw you again. You were grown. And it wasn't the braid or the basket that gave you away this time. It was the way you tilted your head when listening to the boy beside you, your son, I assume now, and the way you waited for him to finish before speaking, just like your mother always did. And I knew then that time hadn't stolen everything, because in you something of her still lived. And for the first time in years, I realized the story I had hidden wasn't just mine, it was yours too, and you had the right to it, all of it. There comes a point, and I couldn't tell you exactly when. Maybe it's a Tuesday morning when the coffee doesn't taste like anything, or a Thursday night when the wind howls against the window like it's asking to be let in. But there comes a point in every man's life when he realizes that waiting has become its own kind of dying, that the silence he thought was protecting others is, in truth, only burying himself further beneath the weight of all the things he didn't say. I think for me, it was the afternoon I saw you walking past the shop, your hand holding the small palm of your son, and I'm certain now he is your son, with a kind of gentleness and strength I recognized instantly, not just because it reminded me of your mother, though it did, but because it held something I never had the courage to show you: patience, attention, love offered without condition. You paused outside the bakery, leaned down, said something only he could hear, and when he laughed, that effortless, bell-clear laugh that only children seem to know how to make, it broke something open in me. Something I had kept locked for so long, I forgot it was even mine. I sat there for hours after that, in the dimming light of the upstairs room where I've lived like a tenant in my own country, holding the old leather notebook I had carried through the worst of the war, turning its worn pages, rereading words I wrote to a version of you I had never met, letters that never left my hands, names I had memorized like prayers in the dark. And I knew, in a way that was neither dramatic nor sudden, but solid, like the closing of a book, that I couldn't guilt and the illusion that silence was somehow love. I'd imagined knocking on your door 100 times over the years, rehearsed 1,000 versions of how I would say, "I'm your father," each one less convincing than the last, because the truth is, I was afraid. Not of rejection, not of anger, but of that look, the one people give when they realize someone they needed long ago won't ever truly arrive. So I didn't knock. Instead, I wrote this. Because writing is the only way I've ever been able to speak without shaking. It's the words I never gave you when you needed them most. I don't expect this letter to undo the years. I don't even expect it to make you want to see me. But I needed you to know that I didn't stay away because I forgot you, or stopped caring, or rebuilt my life somewhere else. I stayed away because I thought the man I became wasn't worthy of the girl I left behind. But I was wrong. Not about my worth, that still wavers depending on the hour, but about your right to the truth, because this story isn't just mine anymore. It never was. It belongs to you too. To the part of you that never understood the silence in family photographs, the absence at birthdays, the name no one said, but no one erased either. You deserve to know that someone, far away and half dead with cold, whispered your name to the wind more times than he could count, because saying it kept his heart beating when nothing else could. You deserve to know that while the world changed around you, your name was written in a notebook hidden under a floorboard 5,000 miles away. And that even in that frozen hell, I carried you with me. You deserve more than a shadow. You deserve a father, even if it's only through these pages. If you're reading this, it means I found the strength I thought I'd lost. It means I chose to speak before the silence could bury us both. I live above the same shop, still repairing shoes, still listening for your voice in every quiet moment that passes through the alleyway. And if one day you feel ready, if you feel like this story belongs to you too, I will be here, not to ask for anything, not to explain away what can't be explained, but to look you in the eyes and say simply, "I'm sorry," and to mean it in every language silence never could. I close this letter with the same notebook I carried through frost and silence, through hunger and fear, through years I thought had erased me. And though its pages are worn and stained, though the corners are curled and the spine is soft from handling, the words have survived, and in them I've poured the part of me that war didn't destroy. I used to believe love could be silence, that not showing up, not speaking, not disturbing your life was a form of protection, of sacrifice, maybe even of grace. But I see now that what I called protection was simply absence dressed up in softer clothes. And what I thought was sacrifice was, in truth, fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being too late. Fear of the mirror you might hold up to me the moment you saw my face. I've spent so many years patching leather and hiding behind small, quiet days that I nearly forgot what it meant to speak without shame. I thought I had become a man who no longer needed to explain himself till I saw your son's laugh and your quiet smile and the way your eyes caught the light, and I remembered that I once promised to return and that I never did. There's no monument for what we lose in silence, no headstone for time gone by, only letters like this, written too late but written nonetheless because something inside refused to let the truth die without breath. I don't know what you'll do with this. I don't know if you'll ever answer, but I want you to know that you were never forgotten, not once. You lived inside every broken night, every stitched soul, every cup of coffee gone cold, while I imagined a better ending than the one I'd written for us through years of distance and doubt. I won't ask you to forgive me. That's not what this is for. I won't ask you to come find me or let me into your world, but if by some miracle of heart and memory you do, I will be here, in the same place, above the same shop, still listening for the voice I never got to hear grow up, still hoping that maybe some stories, even the hardest ones, deserve to be told before the final chapter closes for good. Because I was your father. I am your father, not in the way you needed, but in the only way I knew how to be, broken, quiet, constant. If you want to close this letter and never open it again, I understand. If it brings tears or confusion or anger, I accept that. But if it brings you peace, even a little, then every word was worth the years I waited to write them. We share new stories every day, real voices, real hearts, and the memories that shape us.